Horizon and this is why Russia's biggest threat is actually China. Let's on RealLifeLore. Okay, this was uploaded a week ago. Yeah, so I think this is ongoing threat series that he does, right? I mean, it says Nebula. I'm pretty sure on Nebula he posts that. So this is ongoing threat series he does, like about Russia, Ukraine, and other ones too, I guess. Any RealLifeLore video is great. Basically, this is one of those like default to go to channel, I guess, if you want to know about something like general facts about things, right? So, but even then, even with that, his ongoing threads is even better than his usual stuff apparently, because I always find new information in these videos compared to any other news thing that I hear about, notifications here and there. I'm always surprised, and some of the things that even news doesn't tell you. The last video, I don't think I finished it. I guess that's, his videos are usually 40 minutes. So I end up doing 2 parts or something. But second part, I forget or whatever. But I'm pretty sure the last video I saw about the satellite images things. And in that, wait a minute, I did do the second part, right? I don't remember. So in that, I saw that thing about how Russia bombed a certain place where there are actual civilians there. They say there are children inside. They still bombed it and covered it up. Like, fuck me, that's just horrible. And then obviously there are people in the comments like, oh, this is propaganda, this and that. Like, shut the fuck up, man. Right? Well, can this information be false? Yeah, sure, but I highly doubt it. So that was just fucked up, right? And yeah, nobody in their right mind would see that and think like, oh, there was any justification behind it apart from just being trying to create this kind of terror by causing this kind of a civilian deaths. Only defense people have left like, this is not real, this is made up and shit like that. Like, come on, man, really? So this is going to be about apparently China. How is Russia's biggest threat is China? I mean, I would think opposite of that, right? Because China wants Taiwan. Russia's recent move is going to make if they're going to make a move against Taiwan, which, let's be honest, they are going to do, much easier now, right? Because they are not going to be the first, right? And obviously the world's response they saw in the Ukraine, like what is the world didn't intervene directly. They sent help. US and people didn't directly intervene. So China's like, oh, maybe I'll be fine with Taiwan. So if anything, Russia is their friend in this way, right? Because if they do make a move against Taiwan, they're going to need Russia as a friend, because that's that group now against the US and any other who's opposition of that. So how is China is the biggest threat? Because apart from that, I can kind of see any growing power is a threat. And China is a threat to literally everyone, right? The way they're growing, anything that comes in their way is like a threat to them. When you become this big, you don't have friends. You just have alliances at that point. Like, who can benefit you at that point? So, I don't know. I guess there's going to be more to this. But right now, it feels like Russia would be the friend to China. I don't know. But I'm pretty sure there's going to be some good key point here that tells that that's not the case. But yeah, that's what it is.
It was made possible by Nebula. Use the link down in the description to support my channel directly and watch dozens of additional videos in my ongoing Modern Conflict series.
Modern Conflict, there
Russia and China. 2 countries that are these days more often thought of as close allies, but are in reality more like mortal enemies. Just weeks before the Russian army invaded Ukraine, the Russian and Chinese leaders, Putin and Xi, declared during a meeting that their partnership was one that contained no limits. In the 12 months now since the Russian invasion began, the Chinese have never once condemned the Russians for any of their actions, and they have abstained on every critical vote in the United Nations, as they did in September when they abstained on the UN Security Council vote to condemn Russia's unilateral annexations of 4 Ukrainian oblasts. Senior Chinese officials have openly cited support for Russia's security concerns around NATO enlargement in Eastern Europe, while blaming the United States and NATO for dragging the conflict out by supplying the Ukrainians with weapons and arms. And while Russia has been steadily losing their ability to export oil and gas to Europe, the Chinese have stepped in to take some of their place. Compared to a year ago before the war, the Chinese are now buying up 60% more of their energy resources from Russia, providing the Russian war machine with much-needed cash to continue fighting their war in Ukraine. And to make their growing alliance even clearer to the West, the Russians and Chinese even flew joint patrols adjacent to the Japanese and South Korean air defense zones back in May of 2022, precisely when Joe Biden...
Alright, I don't think that's just China exclusive. India is also buying oil, right? And you can see it that way, right? Like, these people are buying oil and funding Russia. Otherwise, first of all, any country that buys oil, they're going to, find the best deal they can about their people, right? That's their first job. So if India and China is going to, oh, look at that, Russian oil is cheap and we need oil. Oil is the one thing that is dominant for people, right? People go wars for oil. So look at that, I can find something cheap. So recession looks closer. This will make it better. So people are going to do that, right? It's not their job to worry about other people, especially when other people never give a shit about them, right? So Western policies kind of fucked up this, Russian-Ukraine conflict, right? NATO should have just, prepare for this more politically in advance. So it's not, India and China's fault in that way. So saying that, they fuel this war machine is kind of weird, especially the recent CIA report came out that if people didn't bought Russian oil like that, Putin's back would have been against the wall, and that would have been disastrous. I mean, it still could happen since the war is still dragging out, but still.
Biden was visiting U.S. allies in Asia. For the past several years, even before the Russians invaded Ukraine, Beijing and Moscow have been growing increasingly closer together as their relationship shifts ever closer into something resembling a more formal military alliance. And it's pretty easy to see why they would work so closely together, at least for now. In a lot of ways, a Sino-Russian alliance today in the 2020s makes perfect geopolitical sense. But it won't make much sense at all after a few more decades. You see, both Russia and China are authoritarian great powers who each wish to disrupt and change the status quo in Eurasia to their benefit. On Eurasia's western flank, Russia isn't satisfied with its position and security in Eastern Europe. For centuries, Russia's single most important geopolitical policy has always been to control as much of the Eurasian steppe as physically possible. In the West, this huge flat plain begins in northern Germany and steadily grows in width the further east it goes into Russia, to the point where eventually it's thousands of kilometers across and almost impossible for any military to defend against hostile invaders. Throughout the Cold War, the Russians achieved their greatest territorial control over the Eurasian steppe in their history, extending by their
throughout the history we've seen that with Russia, like any power, like I think the Peter the Great battle is one of the example of that. Like people try to attack Russia, the flat plains starts, right? Russia employs something like, scorched earth mentality, basically makes it harder to chase Russians more inside, the more inland they go. Winter comes and it's just disastrous. And even this, since Soviet Union, people, basically Russians wants this kind of land because it gives you gap between Moscow. Otherwise, Moscow just at the border.
Proxies in the Warsaw Pact all the way to where it begins in Germany itself, surrounded by the geographic barriers in the Baltic Sea to the north and the Sudeten Carpathian Mountains and Black Sea to the south. If a Western European army was going to invade Russia again, like NATO, it would have to squeeze their tanks through the narrowest point of the plain in Germany, where the Russians could concentrate the bulk of their troops in order to plug it. But following the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, Russia in its current form has watched on as their once complete domination of the plain has eroded away. Germany reunified, every former Warsaw Pact country flipped to joining NATO, and even the 3 former Soviet Baltic republics all joined up with NATO as well. Belarus remained loyal to Moscow, and that meant that the red lines for Russia ultimately came in Ukraine and Georgia. It would place a NATO and American military presence directly along the Greater Caucasus Mountains, around which are flatter coastal strips that can be utilized by an invading army into the Eurasian steppe. Across from these mountains and through the low, easy-to-pass-through coastal entrances, it's effectively nothing but flat land all the way to Moscow. And immediately across from the mountains is arguably Russia's most sensitive area as well, Chechnya, an ethnically and religiously distinct region that fought 2 brutal wars for independence from Russia across the 1990s that claimed the lives of tens of thousands. At great cost, the Russians crushed the rebellion in Chechnya, but the presence of a perceived hostile military alliance immediately across from Chechnya would be an inherently risky development from Moscow's perspective. And then there was Ukraine. Were Ukraine to have joined NATO, it would have cemented NATO and the US military's presence across nearly the entirety of the European part of the steppe, theoretically enabling NATO forces to land unopposed in Crimea, line up tanks across thousands of kilometers of open, flat terrain, and transform Belarus into an impossible-to-defend salient, surrounded on 3 flat and exposed sides by NATO territory. If you were ruling in Moscow and you perceived that NATO could become a rival and potentially hostile military alliance in the future, and you had the long history of being invaded repeatedly by Western European armies from this direction, this situation would understandably make you pretty nervous. So Russia invaded.
I mean, look, one would think, like, why would Russia think that NATO, any Western countries are going to invade Russia? I mean, there has to be a reason. Like, what is the reason you can come up with that they will invade? That's not how defense work. People just have to prepare for the worst. And if NATO, basically an alliance which has United States in it, Russia's biggest enemy at this point, if Ukraine joins NATO, that means NATO's forces, United States forces, can stay in Ukraine in name of, I don't know, some drills here and there, whatever. It's a NATO country. Nobody can say no to that now. And for Russia, that would be a panicky situation. It's like troops are just there. I can fucking see it from here. That's how close they are. Because that's a very small distance.
Georgia in 2008 and occupied about 20% of their territory, including Abkhazia, to plug up the western coastal entrance into the Eurasian steppe, while keeping them out in NATO at the same time. Then they invaded Ukraine in 2014 to occupy Crimea and plug up that entrance into the Eurasian steppe from the Black Sea, while also preventing Ukraine from joining NATO. And then they invaded the rest of Ukraine in 2022 in an attempt to fully push their geographic defenses against NATO back to the gap between the Carpathian Mountains and the Black Sea, opposite of Romania and Poland. So Russia is attempting to push back against what they perceive as US and NATO encirclement in Eastern Europe, at precisely the same time that China is attempting to push back against what they also perceive as US encirclement of them in the Indo-Pacific. Over here on Eurasia's eastern flank, China's single greatest geopolitical objectives are finishing the Chinese Civil War once and for all by finally wresting control over Taiwan through either diplomacy or warfare, while ensuring that their flows of energy resources necessary to continue fueling their ravenous industrial economy continues unabated. But just as Russia feels over in their theater in Eastern Europe across the European plain, China feels that the US is the most major obstacle standing in the way of their objectives as well. Taiwan itself is classified as a major non-NATO ally of Washington's, while the United States maintains an ambiguous policy on Taiwanese defense. Were China to eventually reject diplomacy and choose the sword, it would certainly face a Taiwan armed and equipped with advanced American weapons, and would potentially face a United States and allied military response itself.
You sure about that? Look, I think if China suddenly decide that they're going to invade Taiwan, I think US Army would get involved because there's lots at stake at that point. And unlike Ukraine, Taiwan would be like a direct, like, if US doesn't intervene with Taiwan, where the fuck are they going to intervene? So it's like a major image damage as well. So I think they would do it. But with the Ukraine, right, within the past where US and many other countries promised Ukraine that if you give up nukes, we are going to support you whenever the time comes, and they didn't directly intervene, even though they are helping with equipment, they're not directly intervening. There's always going to be that thing in the air, like maybe US will support it but do not go to war directly with China because they can't afford it, right? That kind of thing. So China will always have that kind of thing hanging over them. So before it was the case, like maybe China will invade Taiwan. But after this current thing with the Russia and Ukraine, now it's the case of China will definitely invade Taiwan. It's just a matter of when. That's the thing that has become. So that's why future is kind of fucked up, because we will see major conflicts. US will have to intervene. And if US directly intervenes, of course, it's like a direct war between China and USA, which just saying it feels like that's going to be a real big disaster long term, right? Because Russia and Ukraine is a fight against Russia and Ukraine. Russia versus USA hasn't happened yet. Probably not going to happen. Just, why would they intervene now? Or, China versus USA, yeah, that's going to be really bad.
Meanwhile, nearby island states like Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines are all classified alongside Taiwan as major non-NATO allies as well. India, Japan, and Australia are all additional parties alongside the United States to the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, a security dialogue explicitly aimed at countering China, while Vietnam is considered to be another major potential US ally in the near future. The result is the geopolitical containment of China across most of its flanks, and the hemming in of Chinese naval power to its own immediate coastlines in the East and South China Seas. China thus perceives itself as growing increasingly encircled by regimes who are more friendly to Washington that will complicate its ultimate objective of seizing control over Taiwan. And consequently, Beijing maintains multiple territorial disputes that push back against this perception. Naturally, China of course claims the entirety of Taiwan as belonging to itself, viewing the
China is surrounded by all this power who's going to support US and Taiwan when the time comes. Of course they're going to do it. First of all, China constantly attack India on LOC or whatever. China constantly try to encircle, India, basically by, having bases in Pakistan, now Sri Lanka, God knows where, right? They're creating all these bases, basically military bases, even though they are not saying it, in the entire Indian Ocean. All these threatening moves, of course, every power possibly there is going to favor USA and Taiwan. Why would they favor China with this kind of aggressive type of tactics?
island is nothing more than a rebellious province of China temporarily under the control of the Republic of China, or ROC, the opposing faction to the communists that they fought against during the Chinese Civil War that mostly came to a conclusion more than 70 years ago when the ROC retreated from the mainland over to Taiwan, but never really formally or officially came to an end. China's principal fear is that if diplomacy ultimately fails, and war becomes the only way left to wrest control over the island, their maritime imports of energy resources will become blockaded and choked off by the US Navy. Right now, more than 70% of China's oil and liquefied natural gas imports all come through a single narrow choke point in the Strait of Malacca. If the US Navy successfully blocks this choke point during a wartime scenario over Taiwan, China's economy and war machine will each come crashing to a halt, and Taiwan will likely remain free under the ROC's control. To attempt and mitigate that risk a bit, China also maintains a large territorial claim to nearly the entirety of the South China Sea, almost right up to the entrance of the Strait of Malacca itself, in what they call the Nine-Dash Line. A claim rooted in China's supposed historical claims to the region rather than any legal basis, and which directly clashes with the maritime claims of several other countries. Simultaneously,
legal with what? That's the thing. People talk about countries versus countries. What law is going to apply at international stage? Right? Country can just say, no, that's bullshit. I don't recognize that. This is the case. What, you going to go to war with me? The end. I mean... There's no such thing as international law. International law is only applied because every other country is just like, yeah, we're fine with it for now.
China also maintains territorial disagreements in the airspace over the East China Sea, claiming an air defense zone that clashes directly with those claimed by Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, all major US allies. They also claim a series of small islands that the Japanese currently administer as well. And then in the south, China maintains another large series of territorial disputes with India across the Himalayas, lands that India currently administers but that China claims as natural extensions of their provinces in Tibet and Xinjiang, pushing back against another perceived US partner in the region. Thus, Russia and China each feel blocked in their greater geopolitical objectives by the United States and US allies. But that's not the only reason why their cooperation makes sense. They also complement each other's strengths and weaknesses exceptionally well. China possesses an enormous population base and a correspondingly capital-rich economy that rivals even the United States itself in purchasing power parity terms. But in terms of natural resources, China is very poor. China has very little of the natural gas or the oil or the minerals within its own borders that it needs to continue fueling its expanding industrial base. It has to get most of those resources from abroad, which is why so much of China's oil and gas has to be imported from the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Malacca, creating China's greatest...
Isn't that fucked up? They're poor at natural resources, but at the same time, they're really rich at lots of elements, right? I mean, there's a saying, something... I don't exactly remember the saying, fuck me, I forgot. But something is rare on Earth, no, you can find that in China or something like that. Because... if you want to make battery, lots of element of that is going to be hard to find everywhere, but there's abundance in China, right? Things like that. Lots of things that you need to make something, you have to take it from China. That's why people, try to grease China's ego a lot, because you need China not just for production, lots of other elements as well. I don't know, was it Tesla who just said okay, obviously he can't put a factory in China because of the obvious reasons. So he was struggling, but I think then he put one at Australia or something, trying to was it a massive plant that stores solar power energy or something? He was working on some project.
greatest vulnerability to the United States. But Russia is precisely the opposite of China. Russia's economy is tiny in comparison and very capital poor. As of 2023, the entire Russian economy is smaller than that of only New York City, or in Chinese terms, smaller than just the province of Guangdong. Russia has orders of magnitude less.
Yeah, see, that's the thing. People always see this like Russia is like one of the top 2 military power, this and that is because one of the biggest threat, and people automatically assume like Russia must be that like real powerful, like probably one of the top economies as well. No, it's not. It's really not. And I guess all the problems that Russia is facing in Ukraine with the equipments and things, I think reflect because of that. Like, they don't have that much money to begin with. But that's not the case with China. So even though China was never perceived as one of the powerhouses in military, because of how much money they have, how much economy they have, if war happens, China would prove different than how Russia proved in Ukraine war. If war happens with China, that would be tricky.
Capital than China has and nearly 10 times fewer people. But what Russia does have is a vast, nearly bottomless supply of the exact resources that China needs. Russia has by far the largest reserves of natural gas on the planet, and one of the largest reserves of oil and coal as well, in addition to vast quantities of valuable minerals like copper, lead, diamonds, and nickel. Everything that China lacks. And even better for both of them, most of these vast Russian resources are located over in the Asian part of Russia and Siberia, relatively near to China's huge industrial base. Left on their own, the Russians have never had the capital nor the population base required to ever be able to exploit these resources in the chronically underdeveloped Russian Far East, so far away from Russia's population and economic core over in Eastern Europe. But equipped with China's vastly larger capital and human resources, they actually can. China can provide the Russians with the capital they need to continue pushing back against American hegemony in Eastern Europe, and expanding their strategic depth of control across the Eurasian steppe through states like Ukraine and Moldova. And then, equipped with vast Russian resources coming in over land through pipelines and railways, China can gradually reduce its overdependence on importing resources through the dangerous Strait of Malacca,
Where's the
and
threat?
therefore push back more effectively against American hegemony in the Indo-Pacific, granting them greater strategic flexibility when dealing with finishing the Chinese Civil War and securing Taiwan. But that isn't to say that the Sino-Russian alliance makes sense forever. It just kind of makes sense right now, because historically speaking, China and Russia are far more predisposed to being major rivals than friends. And the current cooperation is a pretty major aberration in history. Russia itself has had a very long history of conflicts with powers in East Asia, dating all the way back to the Mongol conquest of Russia during the 13th century, and spanning well into the 20th century with the wars against Japan in 1905 and again in 1945. And for its part, China has had a long history of conflict with European powers as well, notably during a period that many in China refer to as their century of humiliation. The 110 years between 1839 and 1949, when China was weak, divided, and fragmented, and at the mercy of foreign powers. It was during this century of humiliation that the British seized control over Hong Kong, and the Japanese conquered Taiwan and Manchuria. According to official Chinese Communist Party doctrine, the century of humiliation ended only in 1949, when the communists emerged victorious in the Chinese Civil War on the mainland and established the People's Republic. But many of the territorial concessions that pre-communist China was forced into making with foreign powers during the century of humiliation remained even after it supposedly ended. Taiwan, seized from China by Japan back in 1895, remained de facto outside of Beijing's control, still under the rule of the communist opponents from the Civil War, while Hong Kong remained under British rule for decades until it was finally peacefully returned in 1997. The Chinese Communist Party labeled these treaties that forced China into surrendering land to foreign powers during its century of humiliation as unequal treaties. And it is intensely ironic that one of the most unequal of all the treaties that was forced upon China during the century of humiliation came from their current closest partner, the Russians. You see, back in 1858, the Qing dynasty in China was in the midst of an unprecedented crisis, waging a massive internal civil war that would claim the lives of tens of millions of people, while simultaneously fighting the Second Opium War against the British and the French. Sensing China's weakness, the Russian Empire seized the opportunity by lining up tens of thousands of their troops on the then border and demanded that the Qing cede over this huge piece of land that was then known as Outer Manchuria or else. And so, not wanting to open up a third war with the Russians in the north, the Qing reluctantly relented and agreed under duress in a treaty in 1860 to surrender over this huge amount of land equivalent to the size of Ukraine without anyone firing a shot. Then, what used to be known as Outer Manchuria would eventually become incredibly important to the Russians. It's where they founded big cities like Khabarovsk, the largest city today in the entire Russian Far East, and Vladivostok, the largest Russian port on the Pacific Ocean and the contemporary home base of the Russian Pacific Fleet, including their nuclear-armed submarines. Without Vladivostok, the Russian Navy and submarine nuclear deterrent would be largely incapable of operating anywhere in the Pacific, granting it an enormous strategic importance to Moscow.
Young developers.
I understand what he's kind of getting to, but I don't think they would open up those old wounds of the 19th century just to fight back against Russia, because during the Communist Revolution, the Communist Revolution also kind of helped China, so that's the image they would have right now of Russia. And right now, Russia is like the biggest ally they could have with everything, even with the world image. They could just go with Russia hand-to-hand like Russia did with Ukraine. They can do with Taiwan. Russia and China could be band together against USA and things like that. I don't see them going, fighting against Russia anytime soon, even if they need resources or something. It's mostly going to be some kind of alliance or something. I don't think that China will ever be a threat to Russia long time in future. So, but yeah, I guess I can see it, because these are the kind of key ports, right? If Russia wants presence here, right? Russia always has been threatening because of this reason as well, because their land must span from all the east to west. They have bases in every strategic point they could have. So if Russia can gather, money and real power, and obviously with Ukraine conflict, it seems like Russia's image of military fighting was kind of exaggerated. But if that exaggerated thing becomes real somehow, and they really becomes powerful at that level, their strategic, places alone would help them a lot in World War, if World War ever comes to be. But if China takes over all these places, yeah, it's a big threat.
At the same time, the 1860 treaty that surrendered all of this land to Russia under duress locked the Chinese out from being able to directly access the Sea of Japan, limiting them instead to just the East and South China Seas. Perhaps in an alternate timeline where the Russian conquest never happened, the Sea of Japan would have been referred to in Beijing as the North China Sea. And for a century and a half since that annexation, there have been many Chinese nationalists who have never forgotten what happened, and many who have labeled the loss of Outer Manchuria as yet another of China's unequal treaties to foreign powers, including among them the founder of the People's Republic of China himself, Mao Zedong. In the 1960s, China and the Soviet Union's relationship began to deteriorate significantly over their different interpretations of Marxism-Leninism. In 1964, Mao privately made comments with a delegation from the Japanese Socialist Party that the Russians had unilaterally absorbed Outer Manchuria into their country a century ago, and that the issue had still never been resolved. His comments were leaked to the public and sparked outrage in Moscow. Then, 4 years later, in 1968, the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia in order to put down a revolt and published the Brezhnev Doctrine, insisting that Moscow reserve the right to topple any other communist government that was straying too far away from the global communist movement as Moscow defined it. To Mao, the Brezhnev Doctrine appeared to indicate an ideological justification for the Soviets to invade China and overthrow him as well, and so he decided to manufacture a crisis along the Sino-Soviet border. In the very Far East, across the lands that had once been Outer Manchuria, the boundary between the Soviet Union and China was marked by the Amur and Ussuri rivers. The Soviets insisted that the border between themselves and China were the banks of these rivers on the Chinese side, effectively implying that all of the islands within the rivers belonged to the Soviets in their entirety. Mao disagreed with this interpretation and insisted that the boundary instead ran through the midpoint of the rivers, meaning that islands on the Chinese side of that line were in fact Chinese. The matter came to a boiling point in March of 1969 over an island the Chinese claimed on their side of the river as Zhenbao, and which the Soviets claimed within their river as Damansky. For weeks, hundreds of Chinese and Soviet troops battled against each other for control over the island, with dozens getting killed on both sides and hundreds more wounded. The world's two biggest communist countries fired over 10,000 rounds of artillery at each other and were approaching the brink of full-scale nuclear.
Okay, is he using AK-47 as a club like that? What is happening here? What the fuck is happening here?
War. According to numerous insider reports, the Soviet high command at the time was terrified of a greater war with China. Mao was claiming that the issue was over the islands in the river, but that seemed far too insignificant. The Chinese had well over 1.5 million soldiers deployed near to their border with the Soviet Far East, compared to only 350,000 soldiers over on the Soviet side. Mao had made private comments just a few years previously effectively labeling the 1860 Russian annexation of Outer Manchuria as an unequal treaty. And the big fear in Moscow at the time was that he was preparing to retake all of it.
Yeah, at that time it would make sense. That's how it would look. Anybody in USSR would think that they are trying to take back this region, because at that time it would be close enough and would feel unjust enough from Chinese side, so they would try to take in. And I was about to say that, like, this island, they're fighting over this island. I mean, I get it. Conflict can happen over a small thing. But, not this way, right? Not between these two power and not with this many soldier. So I guess overall idea would have been to take entire Manchuria, whatever. The Russians took it, right? Because that would make sense. And that would cut off Russia with a lot of access, key access that they have today.
A few Soviet bureaucrats even argued that the only way for the country to stop the vastly numerically superior Chinese forces from seizing the area would be by deploying nuclear weapons against them. Luckily, it never came to that and the crisis gradually died down, but the border remained theoretically in dispute between them all the way until it was formally demarcated in 1991.
Let's be honest, only reason that happened is because of nukes. No way Mao would have been like, okay, you know what, we're fine. No. He wouldn't have been like that. He would have gone all in, but he knows that, Russia has nukes, so let's not do that.
Just because they both finally legally agreed on the border in 1991 doesn't mean that they will always legally agree on it forever, especially from the perspective of paranoid planners in the Kremlin. After all, Russia itself agreed on the internationally recognized borders with Ukraine through multiple treaties in 1994 and 1997, only to then a couple decades later renege on those treaties based on their supposedly historical, rather than legal, claims to Ukrainian territories like Crimea and the Donbass. Russia invaded and then conquered large swaths of Ukrainian territory based on their supposed historical claims to those territories, opening up the Pandora's box of China hypothetically doing the very same thing with their historical claims to Outer Manchuria at some point in the distant future. But the historical strains over Outer Manchuria are far from the only place of divergence.
I don't get why people put so much emphasis on justification. Justifications don't matter, man. These are just words on a paper at that point. It's like, do you have power to actually pull this shit off? Then you find justification. So even it's not going to be like, see, you used this kind of historical justification against Ukraine, so I'm going to do the same thing with this Manchuria and this area. China's not going to do that because, Russia is still powerful, Russia still have lots of nukes, and China would not want that kind of a conflict with Russia, since they already have enough enemy around the world, right? They're not going to do that. And, relationship between Russia and India is strong for years, right? And India doesn't like China that much for obvious reason. So that would mean that China is going to fight Russia in north and in south with India. Not gonna happen, right? So it's not about justification. It's not about like opening precedent or opening Pandora's box or whatever he said it. It's about, can they do it? Are they powerful enough to pull it off? If they can, then they would find justification later. Otherwise, what's right, what's not, doesn't matter at this international stage.
Between Moscow and Beijing. After the Soviet Union collapsed, 5 new countries emerged in Central Asia after centuries of domination from Moscow. And over the decades since then, most of them have moved away from Russia and gotten closer to China. China has spent the years here carefully cultivating its Belt and Road Initiative, which seeks to restore the ancient Silk Road trade routes running across Central Asia. The region is rich in hydrocarbon resources like oil and gas that the ever-hungry and resource-poor Chinese economy needs to keep itself running. With Chinese backing, pipelines for oil and gas were all built from hydrocarbon-rich countries like Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan that all now flow east towards China. From these 3 countries, China now imports around 15% of its entire natural gas demand, greatly helping Beijing in overcoming its heavy reliance on more vulnerable liquefied natural gas imports coming in from sea through the Malacca Strait. And at the same time, China is now by far the largest customer of Turkmenistan's and Uzbekistan's natural gas supplies. 2 countries that used to be ruled from Moscow that now directly and massively compete with Russia for the growing natural gas trade in China. The only big market left for the Russians to sell to, now that their market in Europe has largely shut them out over the war in Ukraine.
See, I remember watching a RealLifeLore video about how China is trying to build canals through Balkans into the Europe. This also makes sense, right? Because their reliance on basically sea route, which is a problem because of Taiwan and how the choke points are there, would make sense why they're trying to create canals. At the time I saw the video, I'm like, that's ballsy. China's flexing a lot, because if they can do it, they will. But apparently it's not just about if they can do it. It's like they have to, because they feel like they're getting choked. I don't know. Yeah, that's if really US decides to blockade those shit for any political reason, China would be in trouble because of these canals. Yeah, it would be easier.
Its massive and still growing capital and industrial base, China has also overtaken Russia in terms of trade volumes with all of the Central Asian states since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Consequently, all of the Central Asian states have a viable and more attractive economic alternative to Russia these days. And that's largely why 3 of them, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, never joined on with Russia's Eurasian Economic Union. Basically Moscow's version of the European Union consisting of former Soviet states. Instead, they all 3 more heavily participate with China's Belt and Road Initiative. This is complicated for Russia. Geographic control over Central Asia has been an imperative foreign policy goal of Moscow's for centuries, because it contains yet another of the most major historical invasion routes into the flat Eurasian steppe. The pretty easy to travel across flat gap that runs through modern Uzbekistan, in between the hostile Karakum Desert in the west and the towering Tian Shan Mountains in the east. But Russia also needs to accommodate China's growing interest in the region, because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, China's objectives in Central Asia span far beyond simply acquiring the region's rich hydrocarbons. China also wanted to stabilize their turbulent Xinjiang province, a region racked by internal violence and instability, fueled by ethnic and religious differences from the majority Han Chinese government. By the early 2010s, the instability in Xinjiang had reached a boiling point, and the Chinese Communist Party decided to respond with harsh repression. Sometime around 2012, the Chinese People's Armed Police established a permanent presence just across from their border in Tajikistan along the Tajik side of the Wakhan Corridor, the narrow strip of Afghanistan that just reaches out and barely touches China. Their objective in doing this was to stop the spread of Islamist militants and arms flowing into turbulent Xinjiang from Afghanistan and Pakistan. But Tajikistan was also a member of the CSTO military alliance led by Moscow, and they never asked the Russians for permission. The fact that a supposed CSTO member and former Soviet republic had secretly granted another foreign power access to deploy military bases on its territory was a severe affront to the Russians, and a sign of their growing displacement in Central Asia at the hands of the Chinese. But for now, Russia has little other choice but to accept the new reality in the region and
things like that just shows like China's too big to give a shit about anyone. Just like Russians gonna be pissed, who gives a shit, right? This is about our internal security. We are gonna do this.
Beijing's emerging supremacy. Moscow's more important focus is on their perceived fight against the West across the European plain, and losing influence and ground in Central Asia to China appears a price they are willing to pay in order to maintain that focus. but a price they may not be so willing to pay will be on another major point of divergence between them in the not-so-distant future. One of the greatest macro problems that will be facing China this century is a major shortage of available water. China itself is currently home to around 20% of the human population, but China also only controls around 7% of the world's available surface freshwater. And then to make matters even worse, around 80% of China's limited water supplies are found exclusively in southern China and Tibet. The North China Plain, where big cities like Beijing and Tianjin are located on, is one of the most heavily populated locations on the planet, with more than 400 million people who call it home. And yet the whole plain only has enough local.
Seriously, there are water issues in these places, and they're one of the most highly populated. I mean, didn't they know that when they populated these cities and made them? I guess clearly they didn't, because probably older cities. At the time they didn't realize this level. But yeah, now it's going to be an issue. Damn. Look, man, countries have enough money that if they, decide that they make some plans to, convert salt water into drinkable water. Yeah, it's hard, but it's much harder to, I guess, have no water, right? And lots of countries, even though not everybody is rich and flowing with money, but the way they spend money in certain ridiculous things in name of defense, that shows you that if they really wanted, they could spend just the right amount of money to, I guess, convert the water. So I don't know. I feel like water issue is going to be there, but when the back is against the wall, these countries will have to invest in projects like that.
Water resources to match the water consumption rate in Saudi Arabia, a desert country home to less than 1/10 of the population. All the rest of the North China Plain's water supply must come in from other parts of China via pipes and aqueducts or from abroad, while the warming effects of climate change throughout the rest of the 21st century will only inevitably make this situation even worse with time. In 2022, a record-shattering drought in China saw the lowest levels of rainfall within the Yangtze River Valley since record-keeping began back in 1961. Viral pictures and images emerged of China's longest and greatest river running almost completely dry in several of its locations, a potential harbinger of China's looming generational water crisis still to come. But the big problem is that there aren't many places around China for them to acquire more water from. The nearest available sources of vast freshwater resources are to the south in the Himalayan regions of India, Nepal, and Bhutan, all of which China already has fairly adversarial relationships with, and which are also located far away from the North China Plain, where the water scarcity crisis will be the most severely acute. And further, India has an even higher population base than China does, and is a member of the Quad alongside the United States. And most of India will be facing acute water shortages this century alongside the North China Plain as well. India would never sit idly by if China attempted to move in and take over what precious few water resources they have available. And so the fight here in this direction will be ferocious.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I think India's stats about water issue is obviously there, but I think it's a bit of over-exaggerated because India's monsoon season, and I don't know, India's going to be fine with water, but obviously with the population and the location, there are going to be many places that are going to have water issues. There are already a lot of places that has water issues, but that just shows how much people live in India and how much geological differences there are.
Those facts naturally point the direction of China's water anxieties north into the Russian Far East. Somewhat luckily for China, there is a massive body of easily accessible and underutilized freshwater here very near to their borders. Lake Baikal. By volume, this is by far the largest lake on the planet, with more freshwater available within it than all of the North American Great Lakes combined. It alone contains nearly a quarter of the entire Earth's surface freshwater, and could sustain the entire global population with drinking water for around 50 years. And the Chinese have already been eyeing it. In the 2010s, a state-owned Chinese company called Aquasib began buying up land around the lake's perimeter, and then in 2017, they announced plans to construct a pipeline from it to China that would deliver water supplies. But the proposal spurred angry protests from the local Russian population, who feared that the pipeline would only become the start of a long project to divert the lake's water away to China through more pipelines still to come. the Russian government decided to step in and shut down the whole thing, and no water pipelines from the lake have so far ever been built. But as climate change continues to reduce the water supply for hundreds of millions—
Hold up there. You can't just buy a land in a foreign country and just use a pipeline to take their natural resources, even water in this place. You need Russia's permission, don't you? I mean, you're gonna buy some things and I'm gonna pipeline to China. Does that work? I'm pretty sure you need permission from the country, even if you own it. So what? If you're gonna export something, yeah, I mean, you can't just, yeah. So I think, because of the protests, Russia declined. Otherwise, Russia knew, and Russia, yeah, it's fine. More money for now.
Millions of people in China's arid North Plain, and as China's roaring economy continues to demand ever greater amounts of energy inputs, like oil, gas, and coal, China's interest in the vast water and energy resources in the nearby and sparsely populated Russian Far East will inevitably continue to grow. Today in the 21st century, there are only 8 million Russians across the entire Far East, half of whom live just within the former Qing-controlled Outer Manchuria. This is in stark contrast to the more than 109 million Chinese who live within just the 3 Chinese provinces that border the Far East, outnumbering the Russians by a more than 13-to-1 ratio. The Russian Far East is as resource-rich as China is poor, and as sparsely populated as China is densely populated. And the weight of that calculus has always been alarming to Moscow. And then, only to make matters even worse from Moscow's perspective, the Far East's population has been steadily shrinking with time. Between 2012 and 2018, the Russian Far East lost more than 100,000 people. And that was even before the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine began killing or driving even more people away and restricting Russia's access to Western capital. Putin's Russia has been left with little other choice then but to begin opening up the Far East to Chinese investment in labor, which has long been resisted in Russia over concerns, misplaced or not, of the area becoming demographically dominated by the numerically superior Chinese.
Yeah, okay. See, I was about to say that. This, if anything, is an opportunity between Russian and Chinese alliance, right, rather than a conflict, even though local people might oppose it, because China has people. China has that kind of a effort power, I guess, I don't know, and Russia does not, while Russia has resources. So this is like, this is a great alliance. We both can benefit from it, right? If anything, this is going to strengthen the alliances rather than conflict is not the only thing to achieve things. And in this case, since the entire world is against China and Russia in that way, that makes them natural allies. So they're going to find solutions to work together rather than having any other problem.
For decades, these fears remained mostly unfounded, as before the invasion of Ukraine, there were perhaps as few as only 300,000 Chinese migrants in the Russian Far East, compared to the more than 8 million Russians. But the more and more that Russia has to rely on China to provide capital and labor to develop the resources in the Far East that will be mostly getting exported to China, and the more Russia has to shift away from Europe and towards relying on China's cash to keep their government operating, the more Russia begins to force itself into becoming China's junior partner on the world stage, a fact that couldn't possibly be lost on Beijing. Now, because Russia is so much more desperate for this relationship than China is, it will be firmly up to China to decide the relationship's extent and course. So long as they each share a common enemy in the United States with more important front lines to worry about in Eastern Europe and the Indo-Pacific, they are likely to remain closely aligned, with Russia just having no other alternative to choose from, and China wishing to keep its northern flank secure and continue accessing cheap Russian and Central Asian resources coming in from overland to help overcome its heavy reliance on maritime energy imports through the Malacca Strait. But without the US as a common enemy, China and Russia are far more predisposed to being rivals than friends. At the moment, China would like to keep Putin's regime in power in the Kremlin, because they're basically just giving Beijing everything they want right now. They're distracting the United States away from the Indo-Pacific with a major war in Europe. They're giving China free economic reign in Central Asia, and they're selling China enormously discounted oil and gas supplies, while they're building even more gas pipelines into China to increase the flows further. But if that ever stops in the future, if Putin gets removed from power and a new government takes over that's less friendly to Beijing, then all bets are suddenly off. China has cited its historical claims, no matter how legally tenuous, as a justification for its vast territorial claims in other theaters.
See, yeah, first of all, doesn't matter who comes to power. Geopolitics is not going to change because somebody's new one is in charge in Russia, right? Their Russian relations are going to stay the same, so Russia will have no chance to work with China, just like Putin is doing right now. Even if there's some new guy comes who has different views, he has to bow down to these things because there's not much option left. See, the title, why Russia's biggest threat is actually China, because nobody else is left, right? Right now, Russia and China is the only thing that's left for Russia, and that's why they would become a threat in the future. That's the thing. So it doesn't matter if the new guy comes, he's just going to be like, okay, we still need China, we still need to sell it.
Like in the South China Sea, it is always possible in the future that if Beijing finds itself in a position where it is the senior partner in an alliance with a desperate and ostracized Russia, where Beijing wields an outsized influence as the #1 customer by far of Russia's energy-based economy, that Beijing could make certain demands from Russia that Moscow couldn't possibly refuse. In this future, if the Russians ever decide to stop or slow down the deliveries of energy and water resources to China, or raise their prices, they may find themselves at the mercy of a revisionist China who suddenly decides to invoke their historical claims to Outer Manchuria once again, and by proxy, perhaps even more of the almost uninhabited Russian Far East beyond Outer Manchuria as well. If Russia finds itself in a weakened geopolitical position, with a military disgraced by a disastrously failed war, a terminal demographic decline that they can't possibly reverse, and an economy completely based around selling resources to China, then what other answer than yes could they possibly give an aggressive and expansionist China making territorial demands of them?
Nukes. That's the answer they would give. People are forgetting that in the Russian-Ukraine conflict, Ukraine doesn't have nukes, and that's the war we have right now. If there is any other war with any other country that has nukes, there won't be any war. Because as soon as somebody crosses the border, the threat would be there, back off or I'm throwing a nuke. That's what would happen, right? And if somebody doesn't back off, they will throw off nuke because they are deterrent for a reason. China, doesn't matter how weak Russia gets, will not invade Russia because Russia has fuck tons of nukes, right? They would drop it left and right because they would feel desperate enough to do so. So yeah, that's not happening. This Ukraine-Russia conflict doesn't mean everybody's going to start fighting now. Lots of major power around the world has nukes. There's a reason why they are deterrents. They're not going to entertain a bit of conflict. Okay, I'm fine with the conflict now. Okay, let's see what China does. Oh, look at that. They've taken lots of our cities. Let's wait a bit. And then after a few months, no. At the start, they'll be like, either stop it now or never. That's what's going to happen if some country has nuke. If you invade a country that has nukes, the response is going to be much faster with some warning. That's it.
A formal alliance with China is a very, very dangerous one for this exact reason. And it's likely why the Kremlin will continue to sell resources to China and cooperate with them to an extent in the near term. But it's also why long-term cooperation over the span of decades between them is highly unlikely. The historical fault lines around Outer Manchuria, Russian fears of China's demographic superiority, China's displacement of Russian influence in Central Asia, and the looming water crisis in the North China Plain all point towards divergence between Moscow and Beijing in the eventual future. And as Russia's war in Ukraine continues to go badly and weakens Russia even further, all China has to do is sit by and play the long game, as Russia and its resources are forced into shackling itself further and further to Beijing. And without a doubt, the invasion of Ukraine has certainly been going terribly for the Russians. In September of 2022, the Ukrainian armed forces quietly built up troops for a surprise counteroffensive against the Russians in the north, which was complicated by the fact that they decided to organize it without informing the United States, who was providing them with most of their intelligence and supplies. Nonetheless, and to the surprise of nearly everyone, the Ukrainians quickly saw runaway success after they attacked. In a matter of only 3 weeks, the Ukrainians smashed through the Russian front lines and retook a Montenegro-sized piece of their land back. And almost simultaneously, the Ukrainians launched another dramatic and successful counteroffensive down in the south that saw them manage to recapture the city of Kherson, the only regional capital of any Ukrainian oblast that the Russians were ever able to capture after their initial invasion. These dramatic Ukrainian victories nearly overnight turned the tide of the war decisively against the Russians, and it sent shockwaves around the world. The story of the Ukrainian counteroffensives and how they were actually able to pull it off against all the odds is a fascinating one to hear, which is exactly why I produced another full-length video that's about the same length as this one you just watched that covers exactly how these Ukrainian counteroffensives played out in real time, complete with detailed maps analyzing what the Ukrainian and Russian objectives each were and how the Ukrainians were able to outsmart and outmaneuver the Russians, ultimately resulting in their victory. But unfortunately, due to the inherently violent nature of discussing the operations and events of an ongoing major war in Europe, if I uploaded this video to YouTube, it without a doubt would get demonetized and age restricted, meaning that YouTube's algorithm simply wouldn't ever promote it to you and you never see it. But thankfully, I was still able to produce this video anyway because of the power of Nebula, where you can go and watch it right now.
Yeah, people, go to go.nebula.tv/RealLifeLore and see those videos and support the channel. It's a really good channel. Yeah. Again, I don't think we are having this kind of a linear thought that because of Russia and Ukraine conflict, any conflict is possible. Yes, but not to nuclear powers. Russia-China is not going to be a fight in the future because both of them have nukes. Russia has much more nukes, right? And you would think like, oh, they're not going to throw the nukes. Why not? It's a threat, right? It's a direct threat to them. And if they lose, the threat becomes even much bigger if it's now or never, right? So yeah, China is not going to fight Russia. If anything, they'll just keep the alliances stronger and stronger. That is the only other alternative besides taking over a place where you can actually use other country for resources. So they can create massive alliances that benefits Russia and China and use their water, lakes, different resources because Russia doesn't have manpower to do so. If anything, that's strengthened. They're not going to dwell on the past history like that. They're not going to use that excuse because they don't have to. Yeah. So yeah, Russia-Ukraine conflict is fucked up because that would trigger China versus Taiwan, things like that. But I highly doubt it's going to create any other conflict with nuclear powers because that's, yeah. As soon as any scale of invasion feels like this is an invasion, that's when people will start to give out warning like back off or I'm using nukes. I'm using deterrence. If they don't back off, they will use deterrence. That's it. There is no other way around that. And right now, yes, war is going bad for Russia, but there was news that they're preparing to use nukes now, nuclear weapons. There are many different types of nuclear weapons. Not all of them are city killers, but they are thinking of using nukes. And I think that's gonna happen, unfortunately, because what's the other thing? If they're gonna use nukes, US is gonna use nukes? No, not really. Because they are not going to use nukes on USA, and USA is not going to answer with nukes because then USA will have to be afraid that Russia is going to use nuke on them, and why would they threaten safety of their own civilians? So that's the thing. If the two countries has nukes, it's going to be hard to invade, but if the one country has nukes and other does not, that's just going to end badly, which is the case here apparently. So yeah. Russia might be doing badly right now because their economy is not that good. So obviously they are not maintaining their equipment that well. Their tanks and things are not that good, but they still have the nukes. So in the end of the day, like many experts have said, the Ukraine winning against Russia feels like that's a dream that's not going to happen. That's just a what they call false dream or whatever. So that's going to end badly. And I think if Russia loses badly, which they are right now, which means Russia is going to have to finish it with even more spectacular, let's just say, results just to assert dominance in the world stage, which is going to be horrible. So yeah. Well, that was why Russia's biggest threat is actually China. Well, the channel RealLifeLore. If you like my reaction, don't forget to subscribe. And yeah, I'll see you next time.